And I developed an interest in ecology and wildlife. In fact, at the age of 10, I read Jane Goodall's book, In the Shadow of Man, about her experience with chimpanzees. And then that got me very interested in animals. And then that interest quickly developed into a worldwide interest in large charismatic mammals. But then that developed into birds and trees and ecology and so forth. And I did 2 high school biology projects where I spent a lot of time at a small nature reserve, which was run by an NGO up near a town that used to be called Louis Trichardt and is now called Machado, which is about 100 kilometers south of the Zimbabwean border. And I spent a lot of time on that reserve because there was a lot of freedom. You could walk around, you could really get into nature and observe things, walk up to wildlife. And I loved that. And I was able to collect a lot of samples and material and really get to know and understand the bush while I was there. And then when I finished high school, I told my careers guidance counselors I wanted to be a game ranger or wildlife photographer or something. And they said, that's not a good career option. And so I was persuaded to do a business degree. But you couldn't hold my interest down for very long, so I carried on volunteering for this NGO that ran this reserve, and they in fact invited me onto their management committee, which was a huge privilege. And by the second year of my studies, that actually appointed me the treasurer, which was another way of saying I was the financial manager. And that was an incredible opportunity and a great experience for me because I really got to understand how this reserve worked. And the interesting thing about this reserve was when it was donated to the Wildlife Society, the Wildlife Society accepted it on the condition that it would be financially self-sustaining. So it had to pay for itself, and it had to pay for itself by creating a wildlife economy. So by selling goods and services related to wildlife. And the only way we could make it work was to sell a whole series of goods and services. Tourism, we had tourists coming there, bird watchers, people who just like to watch wildlife, who like to walk in the bush, etc., like I was when I was in school. But we also had to have a small, limited amount of trophy hunting, which we carefully controlled, but that brought in a lot of money. And then occasionally because there were no large predators there, the numbers of impala and wildebeest got too high, we had to remove some. And we generally had them live removed and harvested, but once or twice we did also had to cull and sell the meat. So I learned firsthand how that works at the coalface. And what I realized pretty quickly is that this was actually very lucrative, that if you managed an area like this properly, and this reserve was only 2,500 hectares, that wildlife could be a very economically productive form of land use, and actually more productive than the cattle farms surrounding us. And I was very interested in that. And the reason for this is because the wildlife areas with a natural suite of species had a better biomass productivity because the different species were foraging at different levels, long grass, short grass, low bushes, high bushes, giraffes eating the big trees, etc., etc. And there was also this multi-product market opportunity. So non-consumptive tourists, trophy hunters, etc. And if you managed them all together, you had several income streams and a very viable proposition, unlike the cattle farms around, which were being heavily subsidized by government. So I got quite excited by this story. And this is just a nice pictorial representation of where wildlife ranching or game ranching in South Africa fits into the spectrum. What they call a nature reserve or national park on the side is a big area where you can have lions and elephants. But then moving into the next line of the spectrum was this sort of interface area, which is not quite agriculture, it's wildlife management, but it's actually a very sensible way of managing large areas of land. And I got very excited about that story. But ran into a lot of challenges and opportunities as I wanted to engage with this, because as I finished my studies, I thought, well, I wonder if this is a good career for me. And, but the challenges at the time were that conventional agriculture was very, very heavily subsidized. And this was for political reasons. This was how the apartheid government stayed in power. In fact, is by subsidizing Afrikaner farmers very heavily in all different ways. And that actually crowded out conservation as an alternative form of land use at the time. And then interestingly enough, what I also realized is that conservation subsidies also had a crowding out effect. For example, by subsidizing by underpricing a visit to the Kruger Park. The Kruger Park was always full, but we had difficulty competing with them. We really struggled to make good money because everyone would compare us to the Kruger Park, and we didn't have lions and elephants, so we were just able to break even. But if Kruger Park had priced according to the demand, their prices would have been a lot higher. Now, the argument was to keep prices low so that all ordinary people could visit the park. Well, it wasn't really ordinary people visiting the park, because ordinary people at the time couldn't even afford to get to the gate of the park, never mind inside the park. But those were the arguments used. It was more to sort of give the upper middle class cheap holidays in parks. So there was this crowding out effect. It was actually undervaluing, in my opinion, undervaluing what conservation areas had to offer. And then this related to this was a whole mindset problem about conservation as being a charitable thing to get into, not a business activity, and something like a prestige activity or a tax write-off, but not a serious business proposition. And this mindset was very widespread and still is to this day, which creates a lot of challenges. Opportunities that I saw, well, in 1990, I visited Zimbabwe as a student, as part of a student conference program, and I was exposed to the Campfire Project, which was in its early stages of development then, and I was incredibly excited by this as well. The devolution of authority and rights to local people, enabling localized development using conservation as a development tool. And this was a great story, and I got super excited by it. There was also this growing interest in more commercially orientated wildlife ranching, so I saw this had a future, and there were moves in 1991. There was a major legislative change in South Africa that sort of mimicked some of the other changes in Zimbabwe and Namibia and elsewhere to devolve ownership rights, and I'll come back to that later, why that's so important, to people, to enable them to benefit more from wildlife. And then we saw some very innovative partnerships here in South Africa, actually developed by a lot of ex-Zimbabwean parks guys. For example, in Bop Parks, which was the legacy of the apartheid system. It was, Botswana was an independent so-called homeland state. But they were given, again, like Ben Lavin, they were given a mandate. You've got to make these areas work, but you've got to generate your own sources of funds. So they developed very innovative partnerships, bringing in private operators, carefully managed trophy hunting, commercial operators to run the lodges and that, but also getting the local communities involved and getting these innovative partnerships. And I was very excited by those opportunities. Did someone have a, oh, okay. My next bit of work, and this was my postgraduate study, was on the rhino economy. And as a result, I wrote this paper on privatizing the rhino industry in 1990. And I did research on a portion of the wildlife economy, which I just called the rhino economy, which I still am working on to this day. And there was a very interesting story here, where the Natal Parks Board started giving away rhinos to private landowners, but they were concerned because they saw that the private landowners would buy them, shoot them, and put their name on a waiting list. They weren't really getting involved in conservation. And so the initial conclusion they came to was that the private sector can't be trusted with conservation. Well, my research showed that the real problem here was that the incentives they created were all wrong. And this was before this Game Theft Act that I told you about came into place. So under the old law, what the old law said is that if you had a rhino on your land and a poacher came onto the property and shot the rhino, the poacher actually had a real incentive. You'd lost a very valuable animal, but you couldn't make any money out of it. So what was your incentive? Bring in a hunter, shoot it as soon as you get it, and then put your name on the waiting list to get another one. So there was no opportunity for a market to grow, for an economy to grow around rhinos. But all that changed with this Game Theft Act by creating stronger property rights and then opening up markets for tourism, for live rhino sales, Rhinos went on to an auction system. The price shot up over a period of 5 years. It was incredible. It went from about 1,000 Rand a rhino to an average of about 50,000 Rand a rhino in just 5 years. And then also in South Africa, we had this institutional support. So parks agencies could actually keep their own income. They didn't have to put it into the central state's treasury. So that also gave big incentives to institutions like the Natal Parks Board, who then sold their animals to the private sector, but they then got that money, which they could then plow back into conservation. So this whole model supported the state system as well as the private system. And I thought, again, that was a very exciting story. And so that led me to an interest in the whole idea of commercial conservation. And I wondered, would it be possible for companies to get in and form larger conservation areas, much like the parks agencies do, but do it privately? And I recognized that the market was very distorted, but if those distortions could be removed, could we somehow do this? And I noticed that there was a huge supply and demand disconnect. The supply was all in developing countries. Much of the demand for wildlife is in developed countries, in Europe and America and so on. And there were huge opportunities to bring about economies of scale. So this is where I saw the opportunity for what I thought could be corporate conservation. And I actually got involved with a company at the time called Conservation Corporation, which some of you might know today as And Beyond. But they ended up going in a different direction. And that initial engagement was disappointing to me because, again, we ran into all sorts of obstacles. The first problem was in engaging with potential investors in places like the United States. And we found that the investors seemed to have split personalities. They either wanted to invest in what they called a greenfield, emerging market, venture capital investment, and then they wanted a return of 33% per year, which is impossible. Or they wanted to give a donation because then they would get a tax write-off. But when we said to them, well, why don't you invest for the long term? You know, why don't you accept a lower return, maybe 5 or 10%, but invest and think longer term? No, they just couldn't get their heads around that. They couldn't understand that. So this paradigm shift was really poorly understood. And instead what happened, we saw a lot of malpractice, mismanagement, opportunistic activity, and quite frankly, hubris, which was very disappointing for me. It was a disappointing experience and a lot of excitement, but big money, throwing too much money at projects too quickly, and the development of what I and some of my colleagues call ego-tourism, which is building these very high-end luxury lodges in the bush, but not really connecting properly with nature and the conservation story that's there, and communities. Anyway, so just to run quickly through my later experience, after that I did a master's in environmental resource economics, and I then got dragged for several years into endangered species trade policy, which I then came back to more recently again, looking at the markets driving poaching and trade in rhinos, bears, tigers, elephants, lions, more recently pangolins as well. And I did a whole lot of consulting for NGOs. I did some work on the future of the Kruger Park. I worked for USAID, looked at transfrontier conservation areas. More recently, I've done some work for UNEP and worked with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, so government. So I've worked across different sectors, private, government, and so forth. I also sit on 2 IUCN specialist groups, the African Rhino Specialist Group and the Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group, and I've been to many, many, many meetings. There are way too many meetings and not enough action in the conservation world. More recently, I returned as what I call a midlife crisis student to Oxford University, where I did a second master's in conservation, biodiversity conservation and management, and now I'm there as a doctoral student. So that's my background, and now I'm going to talk to you a bit about the wildlife economy and what I understand about to be the wildlife economy, and just some ideas on how to build a wildlife economy. So I just took a well-accepted definition of economy, inserted the word wildlife in there. So a wildlife economy is an area of the production, distribution, and trade, as well as the consumption of wildlife goods and services by different agents. So what might those wildlife goods and services be? Well, they could be anything from actually conserving the wildlife on the ground to selling off the ecosystem services that provides, carbon sequestration, provisioning services like that, or selling the opportunity to visit the wildlife or hunt the wildlife, or selling the rights to film the wildlife. What we unfortunately see at the moment is too much of the latter and not enough of the former. So a lot of the money that could be going back into protecting the wildlife and protecting the land is not. It's being skimmed off by, for example, people's experience of wildlife films and so forth. And that brings us on to the question of where is the economic activity happening? Well, a lot of it is happening outside of Africa. It's happening amongst NGOs and film companies and people who love wildlife, but they're paying their money to there, and the money is not coming back to Africa where it should. And who is involved? Well, again, the consumers have tended to be largely overseas and Western or urban and privileged, and less local and African and rural. But I'm hoping over time that will change. What we're also seeing is a shift to some more interest from Asia. But unfortunately, as we know, some of that interest has been in wildlife products that have not been provided legally, which has developed into a poaching crisis in the last decade. So there's also an illicit wildlife economy, and that is harmful to building a legal and productive wildlife economy. So how to build a wildlife economy? Well, it's already there. It's already there, but the question is, how do we make it more effective? How do we make it more efficient? More importantly, how do we make it more fair? How do we distribute the proceeds? So I do believe there's scope for more efficiency. There's more ways we can capture value from the system and redirect it to actually saving wildlife and protecting wildlife. But also, conventionally, and we see this, it's very much so in South Africa, other countries like Namibia are starting to address this more effectively. But a lot of the wildlife land, ownership of the land and the wildlife is in the hands of the privileged few. And the previously disadvantaged have been completely excluded and don't have access. So it's not really fair, and it's not equitable. And how do we make it more sustainable? Well, both of those other elements come into play here. If we make it more efficient and we generate more resources to protect what's there, it will become more sustainable, but also it will, in order to be truly sustainable and fair to future generations, it also has to be more, the benefits and the economic flow has to be more fairly distributed in the present, because that is one of the major problems that we face today. What are the basic building blocks of a wildlife economy? Well, I'll argue that there are two very important aspects here. And the emphasis in most economies is on capital and labor. Well, I'd like to reframe this a little bit and think more in terms of natural capital, which has often been disregarded by conventional economists, but this is where the real value lies. It lies in the land, it lies in the wildlife on the land, and it lies in the ecosystem services. So this is a more dynamic concept. These are the things that the land and the wildlife produce over time. So it's flows as well as stocks that count, and how we manage those flows is really important. And the same applies to human capital. So human capital is people, and human capital is the skills that those people have, knowing how to manage different aspects of the wildlife economy. But also terribly important, again, is how those people interact. So this is another flow concept. It's the relationships between those people and the rules that govern the way that they interact and that the way they manage things. And this is often neglected. Human capital is critically important into building any economy. There's an element of stability, skills, but most important of all, good relationships between people. That is vitally important, and that needs to be built. I'm trying to get to my next slide. Right, what else do we need? Well, the critical element of any economy is rights. And what we do, economists talk about property rights. These are ownership rights over various aspects of things to give them value. You can't trade something unless you have some kind of ownership right, or at least a use right. So we need to start off, we need to have property rights. We need to have strong property rights. Those that are defendable in a court of law, that people recognize, that people accept. And people try to gain strong property rights for themselves. That is why often we have a tragedy of the commons when there are vague property rights out there, particularly over wildlife. People will go in and they'll tend to hunt and they'll tend to overuse because they have a stronger property right over an animal that they've just hunted and captured for themselves than they do when it's just kind of out there and collectively owned by anybody, but with no clear rights and rules around that. So strong property rights don't have to be individual. They can be community-based, or they can even be a state agency, a government agency, but they tend to get weaker as they get collectively bigger. And particularly when it's just the state that owns it and has a piece of land somewhere where it's relatively under-resourced and there's insufficient human capacity to protect that area, that's where we tend to get the weakest conservation. So we need property rights to land and to animals to start as a starting point. Then there has to be market demand for wildlife products, whatever those products might be, and I've just described them to you. It could be harvesting animals, it could be viewing animals, it could be creating secondary products from them, like films, like selling ecosystem services, by selling donation rights, all those sort of things. And then there needs to be a market mechanism. There needs to be rules for trading that are widely accepted and protected and recognized. And that leads us into the whole question of governance. So good governance is essential for any economy to work effectively, and very much for a wildlife economy. And what is a good governance system? Well, when we talk about governance these days, we're no longer just talking about governments on their own. Governance is the collaboration between governance is the collaboration between governments and the private sector, NGOs, civil society, all working together collectively to govern. And a good governance system will manage different value systems because people do have different value systems. In the West, for example, there are people who hunt, then there are other people who are vegan and who believe that animals should have rights. Now, a good governance system will accommodate all those interests, and instead of having them fight against each other, will find ways to give everybody some kind of a portion of the pie, so to speak. It's not always easy because some people play for a winner-takes-all strategy and want to impose their value system on everyone else. But a good governance system will dissipate that kind of conflict. And a good governance system will accommodate and it'll embrace diversity. And I just want to emphasize, we know biodiversity is good, but I want to emphasize that institutional diversity is good, a diversity of values is good, a diversity of different income streams is good. All of these things lead to more resilient and robust systems. And a good governance system will find out the optimal roles for the state, for communities and private interests and get them working together and not against each other. And I'd like to refer you to this article. This is an excellent article, and it refers to a few other articles on governance if any of you are interested in reading up more about good governance principles. This was written with the United States in mind, but I think the principles are very clearly applied to anywhere, to any African country, to anywhere else. So just to give a little bit of thought when thinking about building a wildlife economy, about the new rules of the game. And the new rules of the game is that there is this geopolitical shift at the moment, and it's going to continue, that Asia's economic power is rising, and Asian markets and Asian demands are going to become more important. We've already seen that with the demand for wildlife products, which unfortunately is mostly being provided illegally. That's an unfortunate thing and with bad consequences for the wildlife economy. This is something that needs to be considered and needs to be managed. I think value systems are changing there as well, and we see a growing number of eco-tourists coming out of that part of the world as well, but that is something that we need to keep an eye on because they will have slightly different values and different ways of wanting to experience wildlife and nature than, say, people from North America or Europe. And as I said, there are these growing markets for things like rhino horn ivory, big cat parts, pangolins. We need to find a sensible way to manage that in the wildlife economy. And then there's this continued growth of private wildlife management. And we see this throughout the region. It happens in different ways in different countries because different countries allow or enable private ownership to greater or lesser extents. But private money and private investment and private management is playing a role all across the the region, and I think it's important to engage with it. But what we are also seeing is a growth of what I call the animal protection movement, and I want to distinguish it from the conservation movement. Conservation, as originally conceived, meant wise use, and it looked at the management of collective concepts like ecosystems and species, as well as individuals, but it placed individuals within the collective context. The animal protection movement is very focused on protecting individuals. Some people call it the animal rights movement. I think that's not quite the right terminology, but the emphasis is very much on protecting each and every animal, even if it's in a sanctuary or a zoo, but protecting it from harm. And the more radical animal protection movement wants to stop all hunting, wants to stop all meat eating, all sale of animal products like ivory or rhino horn, even if they are just collected in the wild. And that presents a challenge for the wildlife economy, because that movement wants to see a lot of those potential markets shut down. And at current presents a big threat to the hunting industry as it's practiced in South Africa, in Africa, in many parts of Africa. Okay, now I was asked to say something about the role of communities. And I'll start out by saying that, in my opinion, communities are absolutely critical to the future of conservation in Africa. They have to be very much a core and central part of making it work. But it's also an incredible challenge. And it's an incredible challenge because of the legacy of colonialism, which to varying degrees in different countries has created structural problems that are very hard to overcome. And it goes back to that whole question about rights. There are very few places in Africa where communities are really empowered with property rights. Usually the rights have not been devolved from central government, or in South Africa, for example, most of the land is still in the hands of private people, former colonists, and moving that land back into the hands of communities that in the meantime, where their whole community structures have been very disrupted, is proving extremely challenging in this country. I think it's a little bit easier in other countries. In Namibia, there's been a lot of success with community-based natural resource management, but it is still very much a top-down approach. It's still very heavily facilitated through central government. In Zimbabwe, in the early days of Campfire, there was some fairly radical devolution in some cases, but then that was pulled back a little bit. I think optimally you do want to see as much devolution as possible, but that does mean devolving rights to communities. And that is politically a very difficult pill to swallow for many governments. They feel uncomfortable about devolving rights because it gives away an element of political control, and we mustn't be naive about that. We have to consider that. How can communities benefit from conservation, and are there existing examples of successful initiatives? Well, as I already said, in Namibia, they're very often in partnership with government or three-way partnerships with private sector operators. And then there are many just small examples here and there where individual entrepreneurs have got together with communities and done it on the ground. And a few years ago, I was given a wonderful example by a man who works with the communities in Mozambique, where he runs a hunting concession. And he really operates very closely with the community. And they've built an economy just around that hunting concession. So it tends to be very localized, and there are good localized examples scattered across different parts of Africa. But very often they are driven by very charismatic people on both sides, on the community side and on the side of the entrepreneur, who are then able to work with governments, persuade them to allow them to do what they're doing. But I will say this about community conservation: it's a very long haul. It takes a long time to build up trust, to work on it. It will be far more robust in the long term, but things that are robust in the long term also take a long time to build and develop properly, and to build up that human capital, build up the elements of trust between all the different parties, and to make it work. I will also say that, again, worryingly, given what is going on at the moment, the easiest way for a community to start from scratch with developing a wildlife economy tends to be trophy hunting. Unless the community has access to good infrastructure where you can bring in tourists and get them to the communal area quickly, and you already have relatively tame and relaxed wildlife there, very often it's only the hunters that are going to be adventurous enough to come and venture into a new area. And hunters are low maintenance generally. You don't need to provide a lot of infrastructure for them. They're more willing to take risks. They're more willing to rough it. Then there are adventurous eco-tourists, but they are a relatively small number. The average eco-tourist tends to want a little bit of comfort. And that goes from everything from the accommodation to the food to the access. They want a short trip from the airport or wherever, which is already a limiting factor. And it means that really the people who are going to score big bucks from mass tourism are going to be limited. And they are limited. There are a few places in Africa where they really get that right. I do personally not believe that model can be rolled out right across the continent. Communities are going to have to look for market niches, and they're going to have to exploit the niches, and they're going to have to exploit their strengths. And in some cases, that strength is only going to exist in the realm of hunting and consumptive use, sustainable harvesting, which is going to be challenging given the pressures that the overseas pressures that there are to try and shut these markets down. So I think that's about all I have to say about communities now. I'm definitely willing to answer more questions. I want to thank you for listening. I look forward to having a little bit of a discussion now, and I've left my email address there. So if any of you want to contact me and follow up with me, you're most welcome. But let's have some questions and a bit of a discussion now.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that interesting view on building a wildlife economy. So I'll open up to questions. So I think what we'll do is, if you want to ask a question, you can either put that in the chat, or you can raise up your hand and then I'll acknowledge you. Then you can unmute yourself. And also, if you want, you can unmute the video. And then once you are finished asking, may you please mute yourself again so that we don't have that constant feedback. So if you have any questions, you can go to participants, then you click raise your hand, then I'll give you a chance to speak, or you can also put the questions in the chat. Max, go ahead.
Mike, thanks for that tour de force. I think it was an incredibly helpful and very, very, very well thought out talk. Okay. I want to focus on one of the issues that you raised around sustainability, and I did like the elements that you listed, Mike. I think absolutely critical to keep those in mind. On the issue of sustainability and the nature of the wildlife economy for communities themselves, I wonder whether, we are not backing up a tree that will not result in fruit here, in the sense that one of the critical conditions that is required for it to be more sustainable is that communities have rights to land. And not just that, but they have rights to large pieces of land, which will make it worthwhile for individual households to be able to generate more sustainable incomes. Or maybe I'm making assumptions that are unfounded here, so please do let me know. Now, given that that condition doesn't exist, should we be thinking of other ways of creating a more sustainable economy? Or indeed, should we be expecting, as many people make the assumption, that communities can make a living from wildlife?
Right, good question, Max. So I think it's very context dependent. And I think there are instances where communities can, it very much depends on the size of the community and the size of the land, and the ability to maintain a certain biomass of wildlife on that land. So even on a relatively smallish area like this Ben Lava Nature Reserve, let's take that as an example where I operated. Now we knew that was viable. It did subsequently become a community reserve. It was subject to a land claim, and it was handed over to the community. Unfortunately, it has largely collapsed. And I think the only reason for that, personally, I'm pretty convinced, is a lack of proper human capital. There was no proper skills transfer from the old management regime to the new management regime. All the resources were there. So even with an area of that size, if it's managed effectively, I think it can generate very well. So it's really a problem of building up the human capital and the skills and the know-how how to do that. Because essentially in most dryland savanna ecosystems, that multi-species management system can work more effectively than just managing cattle. But you do have to have access to some markets. And even if it's just a meat market. So now following COVID-19, of course, there's been a lot of hoo-ha about the safety of wild meat. But as we know, communities throughout the region have been eating wild meat for many thousands of years, quite happily without any health problems. So that is something that needs to be managed. But if those meat markets could be at least opened up in some way that could be locally meaningful, that could help with food security. I know having cattle and wildlife and managing the wildlife with the cattle will increase the economic productivity of those areas. So it's just a question of having the know-how how to manage it. I think that's really the biggest, the two biggest challenges are the rights, obviously, and then the human capital, that skills transfer and know-how. Are you satisfied with that answer?
Yes,
or,
yes, I am. But I don't want to crowd this if others have got a question. But I wanted to follow that up with just two minor ones, hopefully.
Yeah.
One, we've had a discussion on, as a group about the progress that East African countries, who largely do not allow hunting, have made, and Southern African countries who largely allow hunting to happen have made. And I thought that discussion was not premised on, some metric that we could use to tell who has been more successful or not. So I wanted to hear from your experience, how do you rate, or how can we rate who has been more successful? So that's the first one. The second one is around animal rights groups. And what I'm finding increasingly is that, they are in a privileged position where they can just shout and say to others, do this or don't do that, without getting their hands dirty themselves. Isn't it time we thought about actually saying, okay, if your approach works, here is a piece of area around Makuleke or around, somewhere in Zimbabwe, and say, make it happen and confront the issues that we've been confronting for a long time with how to bring in communities?
Excellent question. So to your first question, which works better, the Kenyan model versus the Southern African model? I think it's really important to think about this in terms of a scientific experiment. Both regions are serving different market niches. Is either model going to work across the entire continent? I doubt it. I think they are satisfying the two different niches and they're doing a good job, but I don't think that either model can be rolled out across the entire continent. So the one model is right for the one region, the other model is right for the other region. What we see, unfortunately, is that there are folks who are getting together and saying, well, the Kenyan model is actually the model that we need to roll out for the whole continent, and they're trying to impose that through activism, through listing species on CITES Appendix 1 and stopping trade and so forth. But I have my sincere doubts that the Kenyan model, which is heavily reliant only on non-consumptive tourism, and now is starting to tinker around with ecosystem services, I don't think it's scalable across the continent. I really don't believe it. I don't believe the market is that big. And you see exemplary cases like the Northern Rangelands Trust and all the work they're doing, but they are sucking up a very sizable chunk of the total donor money that's out there. I don't think there is that much more donor money if, for example, we had to start mimicking that model everywhere else. And those community-based projects rely heavily on donor input. In fact, many community projects do, and we need to move away from that. We need to move the wildlife economy away from donor dependence. It's worryingly still way too donor dependent across the continent. And yeah, I think that sort of segues into your second point, calling out the animal protection groups. The animal protection groups tend to fund sanctuaries. They don't fund large landscapes. What I don't think they appreciate is how their policies will not ultimately support the economics of maintaining large landscapes, which are very expensive to maintain. And will become increasingly more expensive as Africa's human population continues to grow and the demand for resources increases, the demand for food, all these things are going to place more and more pressure on these empty lands. So the cost of maintaining them as wilderness areas is going to keep increasing. And I understand that one of the more protectionist groups, I4, has started to become involved now in some more sort of grassroots conservation. And I believe as a consequence of that and of their experience, they're also starting to soften their message a bit. So I think it would be very good to call the bluff of the more radical protection groups and say to them, put your money where your mouth is, but put it on the ground into genuine wilderness conservation and get involved, get engaged, and see what it takes. Also, see what it takes to engage with communities and talk to the communities and find and get their perspective. It would be really good to try and push them to do that. But let's see how that works.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, thank you, Michael. Is there anyone who has another question? May you show by raising your hand, or you can type in the question into that chat box. So while we wait for other questions, I will build on to the question that Max has just asked, and also what we've been talking about with the animal protection movement people. So if we continue to have that pressure from these groups, and also the fact that most of the land in the communal areas, which are at the moment campfire areas, are not suitable for ecotourism. So what options are there for such rural communities where they can't do trophy hunting or any consumptive use of these resources? Well, what options do they have?
Well, there are a lot of products in nature. There are plants, there are insects, there are flowers, there are fruits, there are all sorts of harvestable products. And then, you know, generally they're not restrictions on just eating local game meats, just harvesting things like impala or kudu or warthogs or whatever the local culture is willing to and keen to eat. The problem is that in many cases communities don't have access even to those species that have been alienated from them, and they tend to still eat them, but they tend to be poached from state protected areas or sometimes private areas. So really, I think I come back to my point that if they are just given rights, even if it's at a relatively small scale, that are meaningful and secure and long-term, and they start to view the wildlife as their own, they would be far more inclined to start thinking about how to manage it sustainably for their own benefit. So I think even small-scale sustainable harvesting is the first step. You've got to take that first step and then just build up the empowerment by them. Not everyone's going to be able to jump straight into the trophy hunting market and particularly not the tourism market. I mean, I think that's the hardest one to get into. And again, let's face it, communities are going to find it very hard to get access to new markets like payments for ecosystem services. They would have to have an intermediary or a broker. And that's I think not a very well developed area at all. Maybe that's something that will come in the future, but even that I think is quite esoteric for the average community to really get their head around. Whereas I think something more direct, like local harvesting for their benefit, but done in a sustainable way, creating that sense of ownership and stewardship, I really think that's the first step in all community-based programs.
Thank you, Mike. So there was a hand from Marilyn. So over to you.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Mike. I'm in total agreement with almost all the points you raised, and they're very valid. And I have a lot of similar thinking, but I wanted to get to know your thoughts about the likely way forward, because these are mostly problems we've realized and known about in conservation and the work we're doing. What is the low-hanging fruit? Because this is very transdisciplinary, and you could be working with communities, and you hit a wall with issues of governance, and you're out of depth with those problems. You could be working in another sphere and have certain other challenges. What would be the low-hanging fruit and the point to start, in correcting this problem? Because conservation is concerned with literally almost every aspect of society, but conservationists are so limited by resources, limited by how they're trained, limited in reach. What agency as well do you think would be the best to lead this type of transdisciplinary approach to fixing all these problems that are facing the world? Because we are always in a very difficult position of trying to produce a win-win for everybody. You with ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, you're wondering how to start out. So I'm curious what, in your line of thinking around these problems, what you think is the low-hanging fruit, where to start, and who best, or what kind of institution would be best to lead this kind of thinking forward from here. Thank you.
Well, Merlin, I'm cringing slightly because I fear that a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked already, and I do think we face a lot of challenges as a sector. But what I do think, if I think about this, I look at where is the lever at the moment? Where is the lever that could actually be something of a game changer in the way things are done at the moment? And I think the lever has something to do with where the money flows at the moment, and if the money could be redirected. And it's not a massive amount of money that one needs, but one wants to see less money being wasted on activity that frankly has nothing to do with what's happening on the ground here in Africa. And just a little bit more money going into capacity building. And I think there are two areas of capacity building that are really urgently required. And I think that would be huge game changers. And the one is in the area of understanding how the wildlife economy works. So documenting existing cases and presenting them to the world, because there's so much ignorance out there about what is actually working on the ground and how it works. So documenting more successes, and not just in financial terms, but in terms of resilience, in terms of conservation benefits and so forth. And then getting the voice of Africans heard overseas. I think this is a real problem, because what I observe in the world where I operate is everyone is speaking for Africa, but you don't really hear many African voices. And I think, to me, there would be an enormous opportunity if there was a little bit more coordination of African voices that actually firstly tapped into some of this information that I spoke about, but then actually started being more assertive and saying, hang on, this is what we believe in. This is what we're looking for. This is what we want. Because right now I just hear a lot of people speaking for Africa, but not many African voices. They're not being terribly assertive. And they're watching, they're almost largely watching as bystanders as you see white men with big cameras, with big lenses arguing with white men with big guns, if I could be crude and blunt about it, over the future of Africa's wildlife. I hope I'm not being too provocative or stepping on any toes, but I really do believe that that's where the opportunity lies. If there could be more coordination amongst Africans in different African countries, if there was more sort of regional coordination, and then together with a provision of more information and more collecting just basic information about successes, and then if that then could be used to leverage access to some of the big funding that's going into less productive conservation initiatives, and I think that would start to change the game. Maybe I'm being optimistic. Maybe others have other ideas. I mean, if anyone else here has other ideas or would like to disagree with me, then please let's hear from you. I'd love to discuss this.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I'm not sure, it looks like Zoom has given us unlimited minutes, but yeah, if it cuts out, it means we are out. So we'll continue and see what happens. So before I come to you, Edwin, I want to ask a question from Liz. So she's asking, she says, as you say, Mike, devolving rights to communities to ensure they have incentives to sustainably manage wildlife and habitat is a vital ingredient of successful conservation. Why is it so difficult to achieve this? And what role can communities themselves play in securing rights? So over to you, Mike.
The first part is easy. It's governments generally don't devolve naturally or very comfortably. Governments tend to cling on to power. They're not natural born devolvers. They tend to devolve only when they're placed under pressure. And so that leads into the second part of the question, which is clearly communities have to become more active themselves. They have to become more activist, and they have to start asking for rights and asking to be granted the opportunity to manage wildlife and to be given access to wildlife land or given ownership over resources. Again, I think if we could, this speaks back to the previous question, if we could get different communities from different places to start talking to one another and building up a sort of a regional community-based movement, that might become a more politically powerful movement, which could then become very effective. I think at the moment, many communities act unilaterally for themselves, and they probably don't have sufficient power on their own.
Thank you. So I think we'll take maybe 2 more questions so that we don't keep Mike here for too long. So Edwin, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. Mine is just a comment to add to what Mike said around the African voice. I think you are definitely on point, and our experience here, I'm based here in the US working with the African Wildlife Foundation, trying to engage the US government. And, you know, the US is critical in terms of funding, but also some of their policy decisions definitely impact conservation in Africa. But as you said, you know, the voices that are heard here are really not African, or they are far removed from the realities of what's on the ground. And so I think it's definitely a space that, you know, as Africans, we need to consider and see how do we influence these policies as they are being shaped up. From what I've observed, I don't see any intended malice from some of the legislators, but there's a genuine lack of information or authentic voices from an African perspective. And certainly where we have engaged them and galvanized voices from Africa, they have been willing to listen, and we've been able to influence certain positions. And definitely, I think, especially during this time, because of that vacuum, you know, other voices that have other agendas certainly fill up the vacuum, and they, you know, the policies that are shaped up end up speaking to their interests. So you are definitely right. I think as Africa, we should step up and see how we need to influence other regions, define our agenda, and use that to influence other regions. And I think it's beginning to happen with some of the efforts that has been happening. There's an initiative where civil society organizations, like really grassroots civil society organizations in Africa, came together, and they are trying to see how they influence, beginning with the Convention on Biological Diversity, process for the post-2020 framework. So really, as a movement, how can the civil society influence that? And these are organizations that are working with communities and in a way are able to represent and drive community interests and voices. I think we need to see more of that, and the more people come together and push through those kind of agenda, I think others will listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Edwin. That's great. Agree with you all the way.
Thank you so much, Edwin. Yeah, I think it's really important, and we should really push for that to happen. And it really starts with us. Michael, I don't know, do you have time for maybe one more question?
Sure. Okay,
so there's a question from Kudzai. It says, could it be possible for us to package CBNRM differently in most countries, for example, in Zimbabwe? The current paradigm isn't really giving back to local communities. What could be the likely implications on sustainability?
As I said in my presentation, the more removed communities are from ownership and benefits, the higher the risk that they're not going to manage those resources sustainably because they feel alienated from them. And when they don't feel a sense of ownership of wildlife or nature around them, but they do feel more of a sense of ownership with something that they know they can own, like a cow, then, you know, if they feel like I can own an impala, but I can own a cow, but I can't really own an impala, well, we know what's going to happen. So yes, devolution is what has to happen. Look, I say that knowing full well that there are huge, massive political constraints in many countries, including Zimbabwe, and that the ability to be activist and to actually put pressure on government to devolve resources might be very constrained, and that is unfortunate. But I do believe that is one way or another, even if it's very gently and subtly and carefully and diplomatically, that is a message that has to be put there, and it is a pressure that has to be put on governments. So because I really don't believe that unless local people do have a meaningful sense, and it's not just about economic benefits, it's psychological, it's about autonomy. Everybody wants autonomy. Everybody wants a sense of autonomy over their domain, over their area. And if we can give that sense of autonomy back to people, they will do the right thing. They will manage their land and resources sustainably. If it has wildlife on it, they will manage that wildlife sustainably, but they have to feel the autonomy and feel that they can sell the benefits or just keep the benefits or even just leave the wildlife there. But I do believe that autonomy is very key.
Thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time to be with us today. And on behalf of everyone here, I just want to say thank you so very much. We have learned a lot around wildlife economy, the challenges, the opportunities, and I think we have also learned that we really need to start that movement of changing things and shaking things up. So thank you so much for the inspirational talk and for all the answers, the questions you have answered. I think because of time, we have to end here. But so Michael's email address is there on the screen. So if you have any more questions, you can email him, and I think he will be very happy to answer. So thank you so much for this time, and thank you to everyone who's managed to come and participate in this discussion. Thank you, and have a great day.
Moreangles, before everyone goes, I would just like to thank you as well. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. And just to say that I'm very keen to work with this group and to help you in any way. So let's keep the communication going.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we'll keep in touch. We'll update you on anything else happening within the group. Thank you so much.
Okay then. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.